Okay, viewers ready? In the event we have any emergencies, let us know through comms.
High above the Arctic Circle,
Stand by.
and in some of the world's coldest waters, Canadian military divers are preparing for a search and rescue training mission.
The bottom is about 40 meters, 120 feet down. The water is about 2 degrees below 0 Celsius. And they can stay down there about 40 minutes to an hour without really getting too cold.
Lately, the Arctic has been seeing a flurry of activity. That's because there's something locked beneath the ice. "13% of the world's undiscovered oil and 30% of its untapped natural gas. Trillions of dollars of potential profit. And that means that here in the far north, issues of sovereignty, security, environment, and trade are intersecting at a colossal pace in the world's coldest resource rush. The tiny hamlet of Resolute is busier than it has been in decades. Canadian troops are here to train in difficult and cold conditions. It's called Operation Nunavut.
So all the structure that we have here are the original infrastructure that were put together for the Air Force in the Cold War era.
With the Arctic ice melting and with a mining and energy boom on the horizon, the Canadian military is preparing for various scenarios.
There's been an accident involving 2 people. Injuries are unknown at this time.
Today, it's a rapid reaction search and rescue exercise.
Anything else from
With
the crew
no
in terms
roads,
of
they'll have to get there
information
by
you've got,
air.
or- And we'll do this as if it's a real mission.
So radio check on 156.3. Check.
Just flown right overhead. They're looking at their visibility. They're finding where their jumpers can land safely, which will hopefully be over in this kind of flat area over here. So now they'll circle around, which they're actually doing right behind the camera here.
We're just gonna do a 180 here.
The Canadians are not the only ones operating up here.
Have fun, boys.
Over the last 2 years, large-scale military exercises have been carried out by the US, NATO, and Russia.
We did find indications that countries are in fact concerned about what will be necessary for the protection of, say, responding to an environmental disaster, a cruise ship catastrophe, sort of the law and order assistance that militaries do and do very well, particularly in regions such as the Arctic that are so far away from other points of infrastructure.
While on the surface, most of the military activity has been search and rescue, professional Arctic watchers like Professor Ron Hubert say there's another side to what's been happening in the far north.
Take her down to 15.
Countries are developing militaries in the context of military protection. We saw considerable evidence that it wasn't just developing Coast Guard and constabulary capabilities, but actually developing combat capabilities.
While no one expects a war up here, it's not hard to see why Arctic countries are using their militaries to exert their sovereignty. Geologists believe that vast amounts of hydrocarbons lie under the ice here. As the Arctic ice melts, all of that oil and gas becomes increasingly available for exploitation. The ice now covers just half of the surface area it did a few decades ago.
The excitement about Arctic oil and gas is part of a vicious cycle. The reason we're able to access the Arctic is because of climate change, and the reason we have climate change is because we burn so much oil and gas.
The Arctic is the canary in the coal mine.
Ambassador David Bolton is the lead negotiator for the U.S. State Department on Arctic issues.
It is opening up, and vessels from other nations can be expected in the Arctic, but again, not for military purposes. We don't see the Arctic as a military venue. It's all about economics.
If politics were aside, you'd say, well, I'd love to go take another look at Iraq or Iran, or, I'd love to look in Libya. But things being what they are, you can't do that. So The really big expanse that hasn't been tested are these continental shelves in the Arctic.
The world woke up to the potential value of those continental shelves in August 2007, when Moscow released pictures of a Russian mini-submarine planting a flag on the seabed of the North Pole.
Which has launched an international race to stake a claim.
I regard the planting of a Russian flag on the seafloor at the North Pole to be a publicity stunt.
Putin said Arctic is ours.
Russia was trying to call attention to its claim to the seafloor, but it did not have any legal significance.
It's not just what's underground that's attracting attention from the rest of the world. Resolute sits on the shore of the Northwest Passage. Frozen solid for most of the year, this potential shipping lane cuts through Canada from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. For the first time in history, the passage recently became ice-free during the summer months. If it stays that way, the distance ships have to travel from Europe to parts of Asia could be cut by thousands of kilometers. Billions of dollars in transportation costs could be saved. But Canada has repeatedly resisted claims that the passage is part of international waters.
As the ice melts, as the technology improves, as the international legal regime evolves, what's happening is the Arctic Ocean is becoming an ocean like any other. The challenge for the Arctic states are countries like China, Japan, South Korea, the European Union are saying this is becoming an international space. We want to participate. And currently in 2012, there's pushback to that idea.
The U.S. and Canada similarly have agreed to disagree about the status of the Northwest Passage. The United States and other countries see the Northwest Passage as a strait used for international navigation. All vessels have the right to transit. To date, it has not been a serious issue either, but that day too may be coming.
With so many competing claims and so much money at stake, the United States has refused to sign an international treaty which would settle claims to the region.
It's sort of a new gold rush of sorts. It's underway in the Arctic right now, and the prize promises to be much more substantial.
More than 1,000 miles south of the Arctic, Admiral Robert PAPP is speaking at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy in New London, Connecticut.
And what concerns me is that we don't fall behind on meeting this challenge, especially when we see other Arctic nations, including our partners, surging forward and expanding their Arctic capabilities.
Here, at the first Leadership for the Arctic Conference, military officials, bureaucrats, lawyers, environmentalists, and oil and mining industry executives have gathered to discuss and perhaps eventually shape Arctic policy.
But even if we stopped greenhouse gas emissions tomorrow, we will continue to have this governance question before us.
We've got a lot of work to do to be prepared and to be able to respond to all the events that could possibly take place in the Arctic.
For centuries, we struggled how to make actually this boundary. It was done under pressure of oil industry.
In the next 40 years, energy needs in the world will double.
Peter Slaiby is the vice president of Shell Alaska. Shell has long been pushing to conduct exploratory offshore drilling in the Arctic's Chukchi Sea off the coast of northern Alaska. After the company spent $15 million on lobbying in Washington last year, the project was approved.
Frankly, we would not be considering an entrance into Alaska and other Arctic regions if we were not convinced at the highest levels in our company that we could do it safely.
A lot of people here have been kind of skeptical about it. It's not a matter of if but when something goes wrong with the drilling up in the Arctic.
Well, so, I think that's a matter of time, and I think that's being a bit pessimistic. I think the standards we're putting in place are pretty robust, but could there be an incident? And I think, yeah, there's ship, aside from oil and gas, there's a significant amount of shipping. And when we've looked at what's been in place, we think it clearly needs to move up another notch.
If a spill does happen, the cold waters in the Arctic make cleanup even more difficult.
It would make the Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf of Mexico look small by comparison. All those billions of bacteria that helped to disperse the Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf of Mexico just aren't there in the Arctic. So it would be damage on a truly cataclysmic scale.
Just last year, Admiral PAPP testified to Congress that the U.S. was starting at ground zero in terms of oil spill response in the Arctic.
Is the tail wagging the dog? Are the corporations pushing a lot of the activity up there and the government's trying to respond to that?
I don't think so, and I think they pay a lot of money for permits to be able to drill up there. As I said in my speech today, the national security is not just defense, it's energy security, it's environmental security, and it's economic security as well, and I think you need to balance all those things.
The real security threats are in terms of what happens to local populations as you know, the ice offshore melts and all of a sudden their coastline is eroding and their villages are disappearing as a result of climate change. That's a human security consequence. And that sort of thing hasn't been factored in any significant way.
On the frozen waters of Resolute Bay, Samson Simeone and Tommy Soluvenik are hunting sill. For hours on end, they stand watch over seal breathing holes in the ice.
If you move around too much, they're not going to come up. They're going to go somewhere.
So how long do you have to stay still for?
Until you come up.
That can be a long time.
Yeah, like I did.
The Inuit depend on hunting and have adapted to the harsh environment that way for thousands of years.
Oh, they're just curious animals. So once he hears a noise, he goes checks it out.
Where there are no roads, little employment, and the highest food costs in Canada, seal hunting is more than a way of life. It's part of survival. For many Inuit, there is fear that all the changes could alter this landscape forever. Rich with untapped natural resources, Nunavut is Canada's largest territory. Among the 28 communities scattered across it, 85% of the residents are Aboriginal Inuit.
In Greenland, you cannot go hunting by snow machine. You have to use your dogs.
Is that by law?
Yeah, by law.
IU Peter is originally from Greenland, but moved to Nunavut more than 30 years ago. She spent most of that time trying to preserve Inuit culture.
We're the longest still living hunting culture in this world. You have seen the hunters going out on the ice to either catch fish, seal, or caribou. They bring that back and then they provide it free to the community. If we didn't have that, we would be starving.
With a resource boom on the horizon, IU feels that Inuit need to strike a delicate balance.
You have to look at both. My granddaughter, I'm sure, and even my children, could become possibly the wealthiest in Canada. But so what? If we cannot safeguard it, if we can't do it properly, we shouldn't do it. We cannot assume that foreigners and international peoples are considering us or even our rights.
Plans are underway for an iron ore mining project in Nunavut worth $4 billion. It's the largest in a long line of industries arriving here. This is an annual mining conference in Iqaluit. It's where companies come to meet, network, and do business. And there's everyone here from, well, helicopter companies to diamond mines. And as a sign of the times, this is the first time ever that the conference has reached its maximum capacity. Rising commodity prices and new land deals are persuading companies to look again at mineral deposits that were once too expensive to exploit on the frozen terrain.
There's always the logistic issue. We're far, we're isolated, so lots of planning needs to be done to make sure we have everything on site.
You say you employ 700 people? Do you know what percentage of those are Inuit?
About 35% of our employees that are Inuit.
We're not against development, but we hope Inuit will benefit from the development.
Okolaki Yeziak is the president of the Qikiqtani Inuit Association, representing the people of Canada's high Arctic to the local and federal governments.
It creates jobs, it creates business opportunities. It will help with community infrastructure, hopefully with government investment.
But it's not yet clear what development in Nunavut will look like and who will reap the rewards.
The cost of these development projects will be borne by the local people disproportionately, almost entirely, and the benefits will accrue outside the territory. That's always the case with mines.
Political scientist Frances ABELE has worked with Indigenous peoples all over Canada for most of her career.
Well, it's an old dream in Canada that the following would happen. The federal government would encourage natural resource exploitation. That would in turn provide jobs for local people, and then there'd be full employment and Northern society would grow. We've been trying to do that model, execute that model since the 1950s, and it doesn't work.
This is not the Arctic's first resource boom. The legacy of colonization dates back to the 19th century, when European ships braved these waters to hunt whales for oil that would light Europe's capital cities. Missionaries and fur traders followed, and Inuit life changed forever. After World War II, Royal Canadian Mounted Police forced Inuit into government-created settlements, and a federal justice system was imposed. Aboriginal children were forced to attend infamous residential schools, where sexual abuse, disease, and even death were common. The effects can still be felt today.
Certainly the rapid social and economic changes over the last 2 generations have had a big effect. If you look at the suicide rate, it's many, many times the national rate, especially for young Inuit men. So those things are crises. They're leading to more illness. They're leading to psychological trauma.
Resolute's hunters are drawing names to find out who will participate in this season's polar bear hunt. Until recently, hunting rights, like many other parts of Inuit life, were regulated by Ottawa.
This year, first one this year.
In 1993, desperate for a say in their own future, the Inuit of the Northwestern Territories signed a land claims agreement with Ottawa. Nunavut was born. In return for a degree of self-governance, the community surrendered their Aboriginal title to their lands.
Under those agreements, they have given up most of their land, but in compensation for that, they received money, they received capital, and certain other provisions, such as the creation of Nunavut.
The Canadian government controls the lion's share of Nunavut, 80%, and Ottawa received the royalties and tax revenues from any resource development that takes place on those lands or on the seabed.
The government of Nunavut is struggling. One of their big problems is the federal government retains control of Crown land, so the government of Nunavut does not have access to resource revenues.
And right now, Nunavut is strapped for cash. People here say that the federal government is not channeling enough revenue into the territory.
We've got the structures in place, but we still have societies to build. And everything from infrastructure, adequate housing, to education and social services that are adequate to the needs of the population are missing. So there is mention of this in the federal government's policies, but it's not where the attention is and it's not where the money's going.
One of the big messages that's being brought down from governments and organizations up here is get a trade job. Basically, you're good to do manual labor, you're good to do whatever, that kind of thing. And I mean, it frustrates me and kind of makes me angry that Inuit organizations and government representatives up here approach mining as the savior of the economy and social economy up here.
Kayak Ellsworth is a young Inuit activist from Iqaluit, the capital of Nunavut. This city of 6,500 has doubled in population in the last decade.
Town, I guess, or one of the industrial areas of town. This is the Baffin Correctional Center.
There's an acute housing shortage here. It's not unusual for more than one family to share a home.
I grew up when several sections of the town didn't even exist. Like, I know some elders who were born in this area, and I can't imagine what it must be like for them.
Kayak is wary of what may happen to his community when mining corporations start moving in.
Definitely, for me, the number one thing is environmental damage, a lot of it which is irreversible regardless of what the mining companies will say, but it does have significant social impacts as well. One of the things that makes me proud to be Inuk is my connection with the land, and when we start digging it up and blowing it up and making money off it for the sole purpose of making money, I don't know, kind of makes me, diminishes the level of pride that I have, I guess, in being a part of the Inuit community.
Back in Resolute Bay and Operation Nunavut, we were invited to join the Canadian Rangers. These Inuit reservists patrol the coastline of the Northwest Passage. The federal government plans to increase their numbers. Frank IMMINGARK has been a ranger for 18 years.
Pass on to my kids also too. When I go out hunting, I teach them what I know, what my grandfather or my dad teach me. So if I'm gone, they would survive out there without me. We're having a hard time now because of the mining. And it seems like their animals are more sick and not like back then.
So this is uncooked frozen sill. And you got this just over here?
Yeah.
Frank lives near the only operating mine in Nunavut and has seen firsthand the impact of the coming resource rush on the Inuit way of life. These rangers have a foothold in two very different worlds. They're elected by their communities often because of their ability to hunt and survive on the land. Part of their stated mission is what the Canadian government calls sovereignty patrols. But for many Inuit, their concepts of sovereignty are very different from the Canadian government's.
Who is exerting sovereignty? And what you understand by sovereignty is a for debate. For us, when we share, when we catch animals, when we share our residence, when we share area, it is an exertion of the sovereignty.
The Inuit of Nunavut didn't create the climate change that's causing the ice to melt here. Yet they have to live with its consequences. In a place where the land and the people are inseparable, the concept of control and ownership is very different here. But this northern way of thinking will continually be put to the test as southern powers dictate what security and sovereignty mean in the Arctic.
Nobody owns the Arctic. I know Nunavut means our land, but from what I understand from elders, is that we don't own the land, we don't own the animals, we belong to the land.
When you're talking about mineral development, oil, sailing ships, these things that will be affecting the residents of the Arctic, you really should include them. Otherwise, it's just an occupation.
We're living in a world where continual growth is like number one. We always have to make money, always have to increase the labor market. We always have, and it's only when the last tree is gone, only when the last drop of water is gone will people realize that we can't eat money.